Hello and welcome to another episode of the Framework of Tomorrow. This is episode 10, and today I will be talking about the history of protests in light of everything that has been happening in America recently. And yeah, before I get into that, if you're pursuing a higher education or want insight on life as a nurse, go check out Ashley Luann Kay at the Minnesota Nurse on Instagram. She is, of course, my sponsor for the Framework of Tomorrow and the sponsor for, well, she's the sponsor for Rally Network, which I am in. I'm part of a network of podcasters, and she's a really amazing person. Like I said, go check her out at the Minnesota Nurse on Instagram, the little at symbol, and then the Minnesota Nurse on Instagram. Well, you just type in the Minnesota Nurse in your search bar. But apparently, I've been told recently that there's a copycat out there who has the little underscore, and then it's the Minnesota Nurse on Instagram. So yeah, make sure you watch out for that. Go to the Minnesota Nurse on Instagram and check her out. She's amazing. And yeah, so today we're going to be talking about kind of a little history of protests. I put a list together of some of the major protests that have happened in history, going from, I guess, some of the smaller ones to where there's millions and millions of people. Of course, I'm covering this because, of course, you know why I'm covering this. I'm just kidding. I'm covering this because I live in Minnesota, and that's kind of where a lot of the protests are happening right now. If you're listening to this, like, anytime recently as it comes out, you know that people are protesting in Minnesota right now because of the death of a man named George Floyd, who was an African American who was murdered by a cop in Minneapolis. It was very, very sad, and they are protesting that and trying to fight against police brutality, which we do have a problem in today's day and age. Of course, it's not every single police officer. Not every single police officer is like that, but there is certainly a problem in America with police brutality because we see it. We've seen it over the past years, and it's not okay to have. And it's just crazy because this one, it kind of hits a little close to home because, you know, this is 30 minutes away from me as a Minnesotan, and I'm really proud that people are stepping up for this and peacefully protesting as they have been. Of course, there at night have been rioters in the streets, which is not peaceful protesting, and it's kind of been horrible to see that, and they've been destroying that area, and which is really, really sad to see. But yes, so we're going to get right into it. The history of some of the major protests we've had, and this kind of relates to my last couple episodes where I talked about the amendments we have as Americans, our constitutional amendments. I talked about all 27 of them in the last two episodes, two-part episode. Go check them out. Very, very interesting. But this one, of course, if you are protesting, you are exercising your right as an American under the First Amendment for free speech and to peacefully protest against the government. And if there's any problems that come up, which, of course, we live in a world where, of course, many problems will come up. So this is very important that we have this because other countries do not have this in place, and they cannot protest the government, and they're met with just horrible, horrible things. I don't have any examples that I can think of, but it really is a blessing, and it's really cool that we can go out and peacefully protest against, and our voices can be heard. So yes, let's get into the first one here. We have the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28th, 1963. So 25,000 people participated in this civil rights march in DC in 1963. Of course, this is where you hear the very famous I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. Very, very impactful speech he had, and this peaceful protest was, I would say, very successful and very moving in this, and when it happened in 1963 for the Civil Rights March. Martin Luther King was an amazing man. So secondly, we have the Solidarity, I'm pretty sure I'm saying that right, Day March in Washington, D.C., September 19th, 1981. The Solidarity Day March was a rally of 260,000 people. So the last one was 250,000. This one has 10,000 more people in D.C. in 1981. The reason they were protesting was because President Ronald Reagan decided to fire 12,000 air traffic controllers who went on strike and demanded wage increases and safer working conditions. So this is they went and protested against President Ronald Reagan because of the firing of 12,000 air traffic controllers who just wanted some wage increases and a safer working conditions. All right, so number 3, we have, I know this is probably going to be a little shorter episode. This week has been kind of nuts with everything that's been happening, and I've just been kind of busy with some other things. But nevertheless, I did want to get an episode out for you guys. So I decided to talk about this since everything is kind of going on in the United States, and it kind of relates to this. And I wanted to talk about this at some point, and I thought, hey, this is a perfect time to talk about this. So number 3, we have the anti-nuclear march in New York City's Central Park. So in June 12th, 1982, around 1 million protesters filled Central Park to protest nuclear weapons during Ronald Reagan's presidency. So during this time, they really wanted to, Ronald Reagan had, I can't exactly remember what was going on during this time, but I know nuclear weapons have been a very hot topic throughout the years on what we should be doing with our nuclear weapons. And yeah, so they wanted to protest, I think probably the use, not the use during this time, but probably just how much we have, because we have a lot of nukes in the United States. Still to this day we do, but I'm assuming that's what that march was about. And number 4, we have the Million Man March in Washington, D.C., October 16th, 1995. So in 1995, Washington, D.C.'s Million Man March took place, which with a stated aim to unite the black community. This estimates for the number of the estimates for the number of attendees for this was 400,000 to 1.1 million people. That is a lot of people, but they really want to just unite the black community during this time, which is really, really cool. And going off of that, the Million Woman March, that sounds weird to say. The Million Women March. I'm saying that right. In Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, October 25th, 1997. Yeah, so 2 years after the Million Man March. So in 1997, I even wrote that down. 2 years after the Million Man March, anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million people, so this was a lot more people, convened for the Million Women March. The event, which was held on a rainy Saturday in 1997, included prayer, musical performances, and speeches by local organizers and civil rights activists. Very cool. So number 6 here. We're going to number 6. I know I'm flying through these, like I said. I just wanted to kind of talk about some of the bigger protests we've had in United States history. Of course, if you want to know more about any of these, feel free to pause or rewind or and go look up a little bit more in detail on what these were about. I'm just covering when these happened and kind of what they're about, just briefly. So number five? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, 6. We're on 6. Protesters against the Iraq War in America's largest cities. February 15th to the 16th. So this is a 2-day protest. 2003. As a protest to George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq, between 10 to 15 million people marched in 600 cities across the world in 2003. So this wasn't just in America, but it was all over the world. But mainly, at least 500,000 people protested in American cities, including New York City, Los Angeles, and Seattle. It is known as the biggest protest in world history. That is insane. 600 cities across the world in 2003. 600. That's crazy. I wonder how many countries that was in. 10 to 15 million people. Holy cannoli. All right. So number 7, we have the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. A lot of these are in Washington, D.C., I'm saying. In 2004, the March for Women's Lives was one of the largest pro-choice protests in American history, with 500,000 and 1.1 million attendees. So there was 500,000 to around 1.1 million attendees at this march. That's a lot of people. All right, and then most recently, 2017, the Women's March on Washington. So this is also another women's march. A day after Trump's inauguration, approximately 500,000 people protested in the Women's March in Washington, D.C., making it one of the largest one-day protests in American history nationwide. An estimated 4.2 million came out for sister marches in over 600 cities. The effort was also extended internationally with marches in over 40 countries on every continent, including Antarctica. That is crazy. I actually do remember this protest. I was living in Duluth, Minnesota at the time when this happened. And I remember there was a march downtown with a lot of people in 2017, which is crazy. So yeah, thanks to our First Amendment rights, that was the last one I had for today. But thanks to our First Amendment rights, we can protest anything we see fit to protest, and that we believe as a community needs to change and to bring awareness to certain situations. Of course, these are just the biggest protests we've had. We've had many other protests, and not only in America, but across the world, to bring up certain rights, talk about human rights, talk about, I know we've talked about climate change. I know there's been protests on that. There's been protests on things as small as, I remember, this was a long time ago, but this guy was hunting in Africa and he illegally killed a lion. I can't remember the whole deal on this, but it wasn't like him technically that did it. It was like one of the guides that was with him. And I remember people were protesting that because it was just unacceptable because it's illegal to kill a lion, I believe, in Africa, but they got found out that they did it, and it was just a not good situation. And I remember there was a lot of people protesting, which is a good thing. They should have protested against him. But yeah, so I'm sorry. This week has just been pretty nuts. I know I'm kind of like all over the place this episode, and it's going to be a little shorter. But like I said, as thanks to our First Amendment rights, we can protest anything that we see fit to protest. As we see fit to protest. As I'm saying that, here's our random history fact of the day. I found a couple pretty crazy protests that people have protested. This one wasn't actually in America. Actually, neither of these are in America. They were both in Europe. But in 2001, here, this is my transition into the random history fact of the day, by the way. Giant pigeons. In 2001, people dressed up in giant 7-foot-tall pigeon costumes and blocked traffic at a pedestrian crossing near Trafalgar Square in London. I really hope I said that right. A local advertising company created the protest to challenge the Greater London Authority, who had recently banned a pigeon feed seller from Trafalgar. Oh my gosh, I'm butchering that name. Square, despite the fact that the seller had been there for years. So that's a pretty crazy one. I guess the reason they were doing it isn't as crazy as how they did it. 7-foot-tall pigeon costumes and blocked traffic at a pedestrian center in that square. That's crazy. That was one of them. So I guess today you're being blessed with 2 random history facts. So our second one we have today is giant snowmen. In 2010, two environmental activists dressed up as giant snowmen in Berlin to protest global warming. The two stood alone in a field of snow. Still no word on how their 2-man protest fared. That is great. Dude, that was 10 years ago. That's great. 2010 was 10 years ago. Holy cow. I feel kind of old now. But yeah, I hope you learned a little something today, even though I was all over the place. And this has just been a crazy week. And I'm sorry if you weren't super into this episode. You should definitely go check out some of my other episodes. You should rate me 5 stars on iTunes, and I will shout you out at the beginning of my episode. I'll give you a little shout out if you want me to. Of course, I won't if your comment says, please don't shout me out. But yeah, go rate me 5 stars on iTunes because my podcast is amazing, right? Fantastic, because this episode definitely deserves a 5-star rating. Check me out on Instagram at The Framework of Tomorrow. That is where you can talk to me or send me thoughts and questions at theframeworkoftomorrow@gmail.com. So if you wanted to send me little thoughts and you're like, you should do an episode on this, or if you have some questions, you're like, okay, what did you mean by this? Then I can try to answer those for you. Like I said, at The Framework of Tomorrow on Instagram or theframeworkoftomorrow@gmail.com. I upload every Monday at 5 a.m. and have a fantastic rest of your day. And please tune in next week for another fantastic episode of The Framework of Tomorrow. Hopefully it's better than this one. This has just been quite a mess, but I hope I really hope you enjoyed this episode of The Framework. Wait, oh my gosh, I can't even finish my own episodes up. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Framework of Tomorrow. See you next week.
Rally Podcasting Network. Your favorite podcast rallied into one place.